They had been told that freedom was a trick, something enemies dangled just long enough to watch you reach for it. The truck rolled to a slow stop under a pale afternoon sky somewhere in the American South, its engine ticking as heat shimmered off the dry ground, and for a long moment, no one moved inside the back, not because they were ordered to stay, but because no one understood what waiting meant anymore. Anna Weiss sat near the edge of the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite the long journey, her eyes fixed on the thin line of light where the truck doors met, breathing slow, measured, as if still inside a hospital ward where panic helped no one. Around her, the other women shifted slightly, boots scraping against the floor, fabric whispering in the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from too many questions pressing against the same moment. The doors opened with a metallic creak, sunlight spilling in, sharp and unforgiving, and one by one, they stepped down onto American soil, boots meeting dust that felt too soft, too ordinary for a place they had imagined as something else entirely. Anna stepped last, her gaze lifting instinctively, scanning for the things she had been trained to expect, barbed wire stretched tight between posts, guard towers casting long shadows, rifles held ready, lines that defined where a person ended and captivity began. But there was nothing. The land opened wide in every direction, a low horizon broken only by a few wooden buildings set back from a dirt road, their paint worn by sun and time, and beyond them, fields that rolled outward without interruption, as if the world had simply forgotten to close itself in. No fences. No barriers. No visible edges. The women gathered in a loose formation without being told, their bodies remembering discipline even when the rules had disappeared, their eyes moving in quiet, searching patterns, each of them trying to locate the invisible structure that must exist, because it had to exist. One of them whispered something under her breath in German, the word for trap, and another shook her head almost imperceptibly, but no one spoke louder. Then that, as if raising their voices might trigger something unseen. Anna said nothing. She only watched. A soldier stood several yards away, hands resting at his sides, not gripping his rifle, not issuing commands, simply observing with a calm that felt almost misplaced, and for a brief second, their eyes met before he looked away, as if the moment did not require acknowledgement. The air carried the faint scent of grass and sun-warmed wood, and somewhere in the distance, a screen door closed with a soft, familiar sound, the kind that belonged to homes, not prisons. Anna took a single step forward, then stopped, her body pausing not from fear of punishment, but from something deeper, something harder to name, because the absence of a boundary did not feel like freedom, it felt like standing at the edge of something undefined, something that required a choice she had not made in a very long time. No one stopped her. No one shouted. The space remained open, waiting, quiet in a way that pressed against the mind, asking a question none of them were prepared to answer. No one gave an order, yet they remained where they stood, as if the ground itself held them in place, and Anna could feel it, not beneath her boots, but somewhere deeper, something shaped by years of knowing exactly where to stand and when to move, something that did not disappear simply because the world around it had changed. The wind moved lightly across the open field, brushing against their uniforms, carrying a softness that did not belong to confinement, and still, none of them stepped further than a few cautious inches, their bodies aligned in a quiet, invisible line no one had drawn. One of the younger women, barely more than a girl, shifted her weight forward, then back again, her eyes scanning the distance as if searching for the boundary she had been told would be there, the wire, the posts, the clear division between allowed and forbidden, but there was only space, uninterrupted and patient. Anna watched her without turning her head, observing the hesitation, the way the girl's breath shortened slightly, the way her hands tightened at her sides, and then loosened again, as if testing not the world, but herself. A few yards away, the American officer remained still, his posture relaxed, his presence deliberate but not imposing, as though he understood that anything he said too soon would break something fragile that had not yet taken shape. Anna studied him briefly, noting the absence of urgency, the lack of command in his stance, and it unsettled her more than any shouted order could have, because it left the next step undefined. The girl took one step forward. It was small, no more than a foot, her boot pressing into the dry soil, leaving a shallow mark that meant nothing and everything at once. She stopped immediately, her shoulders tightening, her eyes lifting as if waiting for a correction, a warning, something to confirm that she had crossed into a place she should not be. Nothing came. The air remained still. The officer did not move. No voice broke the silence. Anna felt something shift, not around her, but within her, a quiet realization that the absence of reaction was not accidental, that this stillness was intentional, designed or not, to place the decision back into their hands. Another step. The girl moved again, slower this time, her movements careful, measured, as if she were walking across a surface that might give way beneath her weight, and still, nothing happened. No alarm. No raised voices. Only the distant sound of wind moving through the grass and the faint creak of wood from one of the buildings behind them. Anna lowered her gaze briefly to the ground in front of her, then lifted it again toward the open field, her mind tracing the lines that should exist, the perimeters that had always defined her world, and finding none. She took a breath, deeper than before, and stepped forward. The motion was controlled, almost precise, her foot landing with the same quiet certainty she had once used in hospital corridors, but this time there was no destination marked, no instruction guiding her path, only the simple fact that she had chosen to move. She waited, not for permission, but for consequence. It did not come. The space remained open, unchanged, as if her movement had been expected all along. Behind her, the others began to shift, subtle at first, a foot sliding forward, a shoulder turning, small adjustments that echoed her step without acknowledgement, each of them testing the same invisible boundary, each of them discovering, in silence, that it was not there. The officer finally moved, not toward them, but slightly to the side, creating more space rather than less, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were addressing guests rather than prisoners. "You are free to walk within the camp grounds." His words settled into the air without weight, without force, and Anna understood immediately that they were not instructions, but information, a statement of reality rather than a command to obey. She looked out across the open land once more, the horizon stretching far beyond what she could reach, and for the first time, the absence of a fence did not feel like a question. It felt like something else entirely, something she was only beginning to recognize. The word free did not land the way it was meant to, not at first, because Anna had heard the word before in different forms, in different voices, always attached to conditions, to expectations, to things that could be taken away as quickly as they were given, and yet here it was, spoken without emphasis, without demand, as if it required nothing in return. She let the word settle, not in her thoughts, but in the space around her, watching how the others reacted, how some glanced at each other in quiet uncertainty, how others kept their eyes forward as if refusing to acknowledge it altogether. One woman crossed her arms tightly, holding herself as though the air itself might shift without warning, while another took a slow step to the side, testing not distance, but permission, and still, nothing changed. The buildings remained where they were, the open land stretched just as far, and the officer stood without moving closer, his presence steady but distant, as if he understood that whatever happened next could not be directed. Anna turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the nearest structure, a long wooden building with a screened window that caught the light at an angle, revealing movement inside. Shadows passing in a rhythm that felt ordinary, almost domestic, and that, more than anything else, unsettled her, because nothing about this place behaved like the prison she had prepared herself for. She began to walk, not toward the horizon, but toward that building, her steps even, controlled, each one placed with intention, not out of defiance, but out of a need to understand the shape of this place that refused to define itself. The ground beneath her feet felt firm, unremarkable, and with each step, she noticed how her body resisted less, how the hesitation that had held her at the truck began to loosen, not disappear, but shift into something quieter, something that allowed movement without the constant expectation of interruption. Behind her, the others followed in small, uneven patterns, not in formation, but not entirely apart either, as if they were learning, step by step, how to exist without being arranged. A screen door opened as she approached, the sound clear and simple, and a man stepped out carrying a metal container, his movements unhurried, his attention focused on the task in his hands rather than the group approaching him. He glanced up briefly, meeting her eyes for a second, then nodded once, not as a command, not as a warning, but as an acknowledgement that required no response. Anna slowed, not stopping, but adjusting her pace, her mind registering the gesture, the absence of tension in it, the lack of any signal that she had crossed into something forbidden. She passed the doorway and paused just beyond it, turning her head slightly to look inside, where a few soldiers moved about in a space that looked more like a kitchen than anything else, the air carrying a faint warmth that suggested food, routine, life continuing in a way that did not depend on her presence or her status. She stood there for a moment, not entering, not retreating, simply observing, and in that stillness, something became clear in a way that no instruction could have made it. There was a boundary here, but it was not marked by wire or walls or guards with raised voices. It existed in the way people moved, in the space they gave one another, in the understanding of where one belonged without needing to be told. Anna stepped back from the doorway, not because she was pushed away, but because she chose to, her movement quiet, deliberate, and when she turned again toward the open field, it no longer felt like an empty question. It felt like something structured, something real, something that did not need to be seen to be understood. The realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like light stretching across the ground as the afternoon moved forward, and Anna could feel it in the way her steps changed, no longer measured only by caution, but by something quieter, something closer to awareness. The others had begun to move more freely now, though not carelessly, their paths crossing and separating in small, unspoken patterns, each woman testing the space in her own way, some staying close to the buildings, others drifting a few yards farther out before stopping again, as if the invisible boundary still existed somewhere just beyond where they stood. Anna watched them without staring, noting the differences, the hesitation that remained, but also the subtle shifts, the way shoulders lowered slightly, the way breathing steadied, the way silence no longer pressed as heavily as it had when they first stepped off the truck. A breeze passed through again, stronger this time, lifting loose strands of hair, carrying with it the distant sound of voices, not commands, but conversation, ordinary and unguarded, drifting from somewhere beyond the structures, and Anna turned toward it instinctively, her curiosity no longer restrained by the same rigid caution. She walked in that direction, her pace even, her posture unchanged, but something in her gaze had softened, not with comfort, but with clarity. As she moved past the row of buildings, the open land expanded further, revealing a small dirt path that curved gently away, not marked, not restricted, simply there, as if waiting to be used. She stopped at its edge, looking down at the faint impressions left by others who had walked it before, shallow footprints pressed into the dry surface, some recent, some older, all leading outward and then, quietly, back again. That detail held her attention longer than anything else. Not the path itself, but the return. She followed it with her eyes until it disappeared behind a line of low trees, her mind tracing the distance, measuring what it would mean to walk that far, to step beyond the immediate space of the camp, to test the absence of a fence not just at its center, but at its edge. Behind her, footsteps approached, light and uneven, and she recognized the younger girl without turning, the same one who had stepped first from the group, her movements still cautious, but no longer frozen. They stood side by side for a moment, both facing the path, both silent, sharing the same question without needing to speak it aloud. The girl shifted slightly, her weight moving forward, then back again, her hesitation visible but no longer overwhelming, and Anna understood that this moment, more than any instruction, would define what came next. A sound behind them drew their attention, steady footsteps against packed earth, and when Anna turned, she saw the officer approaching, not directly, but at an angle that gave them space to remain where they were. He stopped several feet away, his expression neutral, his posture unchanged, and for a moment, he said nothing, as if allowing the silence to settle before placing words into it. Anna met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice quiet when she finally spoke, not demanding, not uncertain, simply direct. "Where does it end?" The officer followed her line of sight toward the path, then back to her, and there was no hesitation in his answer, no pause to consider how it might be received. "It does not end there," he said, his tone even, his words clear. "It ends where you decide to come back." The sentence lingered, not because it was complex, but because it was not something she had been prepared to hear. Anna looked back at the path, at the faint marks in the dirt, at the space beyond that remained open and undefined, and for the first time, the absence of a fence did not feel like a missing structure. It felt like a responsibility. Anna did not move immediately after he spoke, not because she doubted the meaning, but because she understood it too well, and that understanding carried a weight she had not expected, something far heavier than any visible boundary. The path remained in front of her, quiet, unclaimed, stretching into a distance that offered no resistance, and for a brief moment, she imagined walking it without stopping, placing one step after another until the camp disappeared behind her, until the open land swallowed every sign of where she had come from. The thought was not driven by urgency or fear, but by something simpler, a question that had not been asked aloud but lingered in the air between all of them. If nothing holds you, what keeps you here? The younger girl beside her shifted again, her breath slightly uneven, her eyes fixed on the same line of earth, and Anna could sense the tension returning, not as panic, but as possibility, the kind that unsettles more than certainty ever could. Around them, the others had begun to notice, their movements slowing, their attention drifting toward the edge of the camp where the path began, drawn not by instruction, but by the quiet gravity of the moment. No one spoke. No one called out. The silence formed its own boundary, not restrictive, but aware, as if each of them understood that whatever happened next would not be undone. Anna lowered her gaze briefly, studying the ground beneath her boots, the faint outline of her own steps still visible behind her, and then she looked forward again, her expression unchanged, but her decision forming with a clarity that did not require words. She stepped onto the path. The motion was smooth, deliberate, not hesitant, and for a moment, nothing else moved around her. The younger girl watched, her body leaning forward slightly, as if pulled by the same quiet force, but she did not follow, not yet. Anna continued, her pace steady, each step carrying her farther from the buildings, farther from the center of what had been defined as the camp, though no line marked where that definition ended. The ground shifted subtly beneath her feet, the packed dirt giving way to softer earth, the air changing just enough to notice, carrying the scent of trees and distance. She walked perhaps 10 yards, then 20, the structures behind her growing smaller, less distinct, until they no longer felt immediate, and still, nothing stopped her. No voice called her back. No signal warned her away. The world remained open, indifferent to her direction. She slowed, then stopped, not because she had reached an edge, but because she had reached a point where the question no longer needed to be tested. She turned. The camp lay behind her, quiet, unchanged, the figures of the other women still visible, still watching, not with fear, but with a kind of waiting that had shifted into something else. The officer remained where he had been, his posture steady, his gaze calm, offering no reaction, no judgment, only presence. Anna stood there for a moment, the distance between them measured not in yards, but in understanding, and then she began to walk back. Her steps were the same as before, controlled, even, but the meaning behind them had changed. When she reached the edge of the path, where it met the open ground of the camp, she did not pause, she did not look for permission, she simply stepped off it and continued forward until she stood once again among the others. No one asked her what she had seen. No one needed to. The younger girl met her eyes briefly, searching for something, and Anna gave the smallest of nods, not an answer, but a confirmation. The boundary existed. It always had. It just was not where they had been taught to look. The shift did not announce itself, it settled quietly among them, carried in the way no one rushed forward and no one stepped away, as if the space they stood in had finally found its shape without needing to be drawn. Anna remained still for a moment after returning, her gaze moving across the others, noticing how their posture had changed, how the tension that once held their shoulders tight had loosened into something more balanced, not relaxed, but aware. The younger girl exhaled slowly, a breath she seemed to have been holding since the moment she stepped off the truck, and then, without looking at anyone, she placed her foot onto the path Anna had just left. This time, the movement was different. Not a test. A decision. She walked farther than Anna had, her Steps quicker, less measured, as if she needed to reach the same understanding in her own way, and the others watched, not with fear, but with a quiet recognition that each of them would have to take that walk eventually, in their own time, at their own distance. The officer remained where he was, his presence unchanged, neither encouraging nor restricting, and it became clear that he was not there to guide them across that invisible line, only to witness how they chose to see it. Anna turned slightly, her attention drawn back toward the buildings, toward the ordinary rhythm that continued without interruption, and she began to walk again, this time not toward the edge, but deeper into the space they had been given. The ground felt familiar now, not because it had changed, but because her understanding of it had. A door opened nearby, the same soft sound as before, and one of the soldiers stepped out carrying a small stack of folded fabric, moving with the same steady pace, his focus on the task rather than the people around him. He passed within a few feet of Anna, close enough that she could hear the faint rustle of cloth in his hands, and yet he did not alter his path, did not hesitate, did not acknowledge her presence beyond a brief glance that held no judgment, no suspicion, only a simple awareness that she was there. Anna continued walking, her steps aligning with that same quiet rhythm, and as she moved, she noticed the others beginning to do the same, not gathering in formation, not waiting for direction, but spreading naturally through the space, some moving toward the buildings, others toward the open field, each path chosen without instruction. The younger girl returned after a few minutes, her pace slower now, her expression different, not lighter, but steadier, as if something inside her had settled into place. She did not speak, but she did not need to. Anna met her eyes briefly, and in that exchange, there was an understanding that had not existed before, not given, not taught, but discovered. The air carried the same quiet sounds, footsteps, distant voices, the creak of wood, all of it blending into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, and that was what made it real. Anna paused near the center of the camp, her gaze lifting once more to the open horizon, and this time, it did not feel like an invitation or a test. It felt like a constant, something that would remain whether she walked toward it or not. The absence of a fence no longer asked a question. It offered an answer, one that did not depend on where she stood, but on what she chose to understand. And in that moment, standing among the others who were beginning to move with the same quiet certainty, Anna realized that the space they had been given was not empty at all. It was defined by them, by every step taken and every step returned, by the choices made without force, and by the simple fact that no one needed to tell them where the boundary was anymore. By late afternoon the light began to change, softening across the open ground, stretching shadows from the buildings into long quiet shapes that moved slowly with the passing hours, and with it came a shift that was less visible but just as real, something settling into place among the women as they moved through the space with a growing sense of rhythm. Anna noticed it in the way no one gathered tightly anymore, how distance between them no longer meant separation, but choice, how each movement carried intention without needing approval. A few of them had begun small tasks without being told, one brushing dust from a wooden step, another adjusting a loose hinge on a screen door, movements that were not assigned, not required, but done with the same quiet care they had once given to duties that had defined their roles before the war. Anna walked past them, observing, not interfering, recognizing the pattern forming without instruction, a structure emerging from within rather than imposed from above. Near one of the buildings, she saw the younger girl standing beside a long wooden table, her hands resting lightly on its surface, watching as a soldier placed metal cups in a neat row, his movements precise, unhurried, and when he finished, he stepped aside without comment, leaving the arrangement exactly as it was. The girl hesitated for a moment, then reached out and adjusted one of the cups so it aligned perfectly with the others, a small correction, almost instinctive, and when she stepped back, there was no reaction from the soldier, no acknowledgement, only the quiet continuation of the moment as if what she had done required no permission. Anna slowed her pace, taking in the scene, understanding what it represented, not control, not obedience, but participation, something chosen rather than demanded. The air carried the faint scent of food now, something warm and simple, drifting from inside the building, and it reminded her of places that existed before uniform and duty had defined every action, places where movement had meaning beyond survival. She turned her gaze toward the center of the camp where a few of the women had gathered loosely, not in formation, but in proximity, their voices low, their conversation uncertain but present, the first signs of sound that belonged to them rather than to the structure around them. It was not loud, not even fully formed, but it was enough to change the tone of the space, to replace the heavy silence with something lighter, something human. Anna stepped closer, not to join, but to listen, to understand how this shift was taking hold, and as she did, she became aware of the officer once again, standing at a distance, his posture unchanged, his attention steady but unobtrusive. He had not moved to direct them, had not corrected or guided, and yet his presence remained, not as authority in the traditional sense, but as a quiet constant that allowed everything else to unfold. Anna met his gaze briefly, and this time, there was no question in her expression, only recognition, an acknowledgement of the space that had been given and the way it was being shaped without force. The sun lowered further, casting a warmer tone across the camp, and with it came a subtle understanding that this place, undefined by walls or fences, was not without structure. It was held together by something less visible, something carried in the choices of those within it, in the way they moved, the way they returned, the way they remained. Anna looked around once more, at the women who were no longer standing still, at the small actions that had begun to fill the space, and she realized that what they were building was not confinement, and not freedom in the way they had imagined it, but something in between, something steadier, something that did not need to be enforced because it had already been accepted. Evening came without announcement, the light thinning slowly until the edges of the camp softened into shadow, and with it, the pace of movement shifted again, not stopping, but settling into something quieter, something that no longer needed to prove itself. Anna stood near the same open space where she had first stepped forward, her posture unchanged, but her presence different now, grounded in a way that did not depend on where she stood, but on what she understood. The others had gathered in small clusters, not out of necessity, but out of ease, their voices low, their movements unforced, as if the space between them had finally found its natural distance. A lantern was lit near one of the buildings, its glow steady, casting a warm circle that did not define boundaries, but created a place to return to, and Anna watched how the light drew them in, not as a command, but as a quiet invitation. The younger girl sat on the edge of a wooden step, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze no longer fixed on the horizon, but on the small details around her, the movement of others, the flicker of light, the simple rhythm of a place that no longer felt uncertain. Anna moved closer, her steps soft against the ground, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the kind that no longer carried tension, but presence. Somewhere beyond the immediate circle, a few of the women walked along the same path Anna had taken earlier, their figures fading into the dimming light before returning again, not hurried, not hesitant, simply following a pattern that had begun to define itself without words. The officer remained at a distance, his outline visible against the last stretch of daylight, his stance unchanged, and it became clear that his role had never been to control the space, but to hold it open, to allow it to exist without interference. Anna glanced toward him briefly, then back to the others, and in that moment, the connection between those 2 points became evident, not in action, but in understanding. The space was open because it was allowed to be, but it remained whole because those within it chose to keep it that way. The absence of a fence was no longer a question of why, but a statement of trust, something given without demand, something that required an answer not in words, but in behavior. Anna leaned forward slightly, resting her hands against the wooden step, feeling its solid surface beneath her, something real, something grounded, and she realized that the structure of this place did not come from what surrounded it, but from what moved within it. The women who had arrived uncertain, cautious, waiting for boundaries to reveal themselves, were no longer searching for lines to follow, but creating them quietly through their choices, through the way they stayed, the way they returned, the way they moved without being told. The lantern flickered slightly as the evening air cooled, and Anna lifted her gaze once more toward the open horizon, now fading into darkness, and it no longer felt distant or undefined. It felt constant, something that would remain whether she walked toward it or not, something that did not need to be tested again. She looked back at the others, at the small, ordinary moments unfolding around her, and understood that what held them here was not force, not fear, but something far more difficult to create and far more difficult to break. It was the quiet agreement to remain, the unspoken decision that this place, open as it was, still mattered, not because it confined them, but because it recognized them, and in that recognition, gave them something they had not expected to find. The night settled fully over the camp, not as a curtain, but as a gradual quieting of everything that had once demanded attention, the horizon dissolving into darkness until only the nearest shapes remained, defined by the soft glow of lantern light and the steady presence of those who had chosen to remain within it. Anna sat where she had before, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been impossible hours earlier, her hands resting loosely, her breathing even, as if her body had finally accepted what her mind had been slowly understanding. Around her, the others had found their own places, some seated, some standing, some moving in slow, unhurried patterns that no longer carried hesitation, only purpose, and the space between them felt complete, not empty, not uncertain, but whole in a way that required nothing to be added. The younger girl leaned back slightly against the wooden step, her gaze lifted toward the sky, where a few faint stars had begun to appear, distant and steady, and for a moment, she smiled, not broadly, not with relief, but with a quiet recognition of something she had not expected to feel again. Anna noticed it without turning her head, the small shift in expression, the absence of fear that had once defined every movement, and she understood that this change, subtle as it was, mattered more than any visible boundary ever could. A soft sound carried across the camp, the closing of a door, the quiet murmur of voices settling, the kind of ordinary rhythm that belonged to places where people lived rather than waited, and it grounded everything that had unfolded throughout the day into something real, something lasting. The officer stood at the edge of the lantern light, his figure partially in shadow, his stance unchanged, and as Anna looked toward him one final time, there was no question left in her gaze, no need for explanation or reassurance. He had not told them what to do. He had not needed to. The absence of command had done something else entirely, something more difficult, something that required them to see themselves differently, not as something to be contained, but as something capable of choosing where to stand. Anna looked down briefly at the ground beneath her feet, at the place where she had first stepped forward, where uncertainty had once held her still, and then she lifted her gaze again, taking in the space around her, the women who now moved within it without waiting, without asking, and she realized that nothing about this place had changed since they arrived. The buildings were the same. The path was the same. The open land stretched just as far as it had before. The only thing that had shifted was what they understood about it, and about themselves. No one had tried to leave. Not because they could not, but because the need to test that freedom had already passed. It had been answered in the steps taken and the steps returned, in the choices made without force, in the quiet agreement that had formed without words. Anna leaned back slightly, her shoulders easing into the stillness of the night, and as she looked out toward the darkness beyond the camp, it no longer felt like something waiting to be crossed. It felt like something that would always be there, unchanged by whether she approached it or not. She did not need to step toward it again. She had already crossed what mattered. The boundary had never been made of wire or wood or distance. It had been made of belief, and now, standing in a place where no one had drawn a line, she understood that the strongest boundary was the one she no longer carried with her. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a declaration. She simply remained, and in that stillness, something quiet and undeniable took shape, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in every step that was no longer restrained. She did not step over a fence. She stepped beyond the idea that she ever needed one.